Thank you very much, distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start my intervention, I would like to give credit where credit is due. The great minds behind the Delhi Declaration and the countries supporting it, as well as the UN agencies behind it, thank you. Thank you for providing us with a framework in which we can work in and work with. So thank you for that. Secondly, when it comes to narratives, technology, countering ideology, we need to keep in mind that 10 years ago, when people were flocking to the battlefield to join radical and terrorist groups, now with new technologies, terrorist groups are bringing the battlefield to us. The battlefields are in our phones, are in our computers, and are within our households. They are within our families. They are within our religious institutions. They are within our schools. They are within our friends. How can we deal with such a phenomenon using technology? When looking at the Delhi Declaration and the elements within, we have to always look at an implementation strategy to the Delhi Declaration. These are not just elements for us to look at and just agree upon. We have to develop an implementation strategy. This implementation strategy has to take into account several elements. While yes, new technologies is an online phenomenon, you have to keep into account, number one, the offline phenomenon. You have to keep into account the human element and the human dimension, because technology is nothing without the people behind it, without the people operating that technology, without the people who are the recipients of that technology, without the people who are exploiting this technology. All of these things have to be taken into account when addressing new technologies to counter extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism. Second, countering radicalization online should not and will not, as far as Hedayah is concerned, will be a reactionary phenomenon. We are not countering. We are not waiting for the radical and terrorist groups to provide us with an anomaly and a problem, and then we have to then be reactionary and counter it. We should be at the forefront of using technology beforehand and adopting it beforehand. So please take into account that we are not reactionary and should not be reactionary when we say countering. The second, how do we disseminate positive ideology? How do we disseminate alternative ideology? When you meet vulnerable individuals and you say, I do not want you to be a radical, I do not want you to engage in terrorism, I do not want you to be receptive to extremist ideology, and stop at that, in response they would say, well, what do you want me to be? Therefore, when countering and saying to someone, I don't want you to be this, you have to also provide the alternative. The alternative has to be a positive reaction to what radical groups are doing. Second, who carries the message? The message should not be just in isolation and saying this is the counter message or this is the alternative message. We have to also identify carriers of that message in order to ensure that the message has been disseminated in a very positive way. Secondly, we have to also look at the entities or the elements that are not always technologically connected. Yes, technology and new technologies is a phenomenon that needs to be addressed. However, there are elements within societies that are not technology connected. We should also make sure to keep those in mind. Furthermore, we have to look at elements of resilience within a society. Who are the elements of resilience? Religious institutions, religious leaders, families, and so on. Let me share with you an example that happened in which Hedayah provided a response, where one person was radicalized online in Southeast Asia, and then ended up taking that element offline and radicalized his entire family, and all of them committed a suicide attack on the same day. Hedayah responded to that by creating a program specifically addressed for families. Do families know how to address radical individuals or people who got radicalized online through technology. There is also a generational gap, a generational element. Has that also been taken into account? Please keep this in mind. Furthermore, we have to look at the gamification of radical ideology. Hedayah has created a game for youth called Loonsol. This game has been disseminated to some schools in the Western Balkans, where kids were given some scenarios in which we can then help build their resilience on how, if they're approached by radical ideology, how do they respond in a controlled scenario. Enhancing resilience is very important, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we have to also look at the limitations that we have and the limitations that we can respond to. For example, deplatforming. Our good friend has recently spoke about deplatforming. Yes, deplatforming does work, but what are the limitations to deplatforming? You will delete an account, but there is still an individual behind that computer still typing away. He can move to another account. He can move to another platform. Some even come back to the same platform again. Some radical groups actually write, this is my 40th account, my 30th account, and we will pursue. And they take that as a sense of pride. So please keep in mind the limitations as well to our efforts in order we can counter it in a very effective way. The good news is that we as Hedayah, we can rightfully say that the elements of the Hedayah Declaration has already been implemented in our programs. Reading elements within the Hedayah Declaration, I can easily link to some of the programs that we have done already. One example, the Tech to Protect program. This was an innovation camp that Hedayah has done both in Tunisia and in Tajikistan, where we brought a group of university students and trained them on countering radical ideology online and let them come up with their own solution on how to do that. Two of the students created an app that is a fact checker as well as an online community to discuss radicalization in a non-security and a non-policing way. This actually got the attention of the Peace Week committee in Geneva, and they invited those students from Tunisia to fly to Geneva to give a human rights context on how Hedayah trained youth on how to counter radical ideology online, using their own approaches, and that is local made and contextualized. The second in Kosovo, funded by our good friends in the United States government, a program called Happy Online. This is an online campaign to help parents engage with their children and vice versa. This campaign has reached about 16 million people. I would like to also give my last statement, which is the pandemic project. COVID has been used by radical groups online to disseminate radical ideology through technology. Please keep in mind the Hedayah programs that we have done on narratives online during COVID, because that is being used now even in a post-COVID world. And thank you very much for your attention.